we're in a climate change crisis at the moment, and it's been estimated that we'll exhaust our carbon budget remaining. So what that means is that we should be very interested in the greenhouse gas emissions that are occurring over the next 7 years, because they really are key to staying within that budget and avoiding all the damaging consequences of going over that 1.5 degrees threshold.
Kia ora, I'm Troy, HERA's Chief Executive, and welcome to Stirring the Pot. Thanks for connecting. If you're new, here's what you can expect. We're going to be talking the tough stuff, the things that keep us middle minds up at night. There are many challenges facing our industry and equally many opinions on how we should tackle them. Stirring the Pot provides a facilitated forum to discuss and challenge these viewpoints.
So let's get to the nuts and bolts of it. Today we're having a kōrero with Sarah McLaren, the Sustainable Future Project Lead for the HERA-led and Endeavour Funded Construction 4.0 research via MB.
Sarah, can you tell us what is dynamic LCA?
Well, to do that, I probably need to explain what static LCA is first, which is the conventional approach that's used in LCA, which is where you assess a product or a service and you look at all the impacts over its whole life cycle and add them up for one number for each impact category, like climate change or eutrophication or whatever. With dynamic LCA, we're actually more interested in the timeline over which those impacts occur, and we differentiate at what time period they occur.
And why is that temporal difference important?
If we take climate change as an example, we're in a climate change crisis at the moment, and it's been estimated that we'll exhaust our carbon budget remaining that enables us to stay below a 1.5 degrees centigrade average temperature rise, that we'll exhaust that budget within about 7 years. So what that means is that we should be very interested in the greenhouse gas emissions that are occurring over the next 7 years, because they really are key to staying within that budget and avoiding all the damaging consequences of going over that 1.5 degrees threshold.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of uptake globally, it's correct that static LCA is the predominant approach. How advanced is dynamic LCA generally?
It's a good question. So it's kind of useful, I think, to tease out different dimensions of what you need to consider in a dynamic LCA. So I kind of think of them in terms of modelling and assessment. So in terms of modelling, we can look at activities that occur along a timeline, and then how do we model them? Do we use the current technologies or do we anticipate a future technology? And that's for short-lived products, that's fine. We just use kind of what's going on at the moment. But for long-lived products like buildings, they're still going to be here and functioning in about 50 years, 80 years, even longer. And so is it actually right to model them using current technologies, or should we be looking and anticipating what might actually be happening in future in terms of these technologies? So in terms of modelling, like people who do LCA have been doing scenario analysis for a long time, not particularly, I think, focusing on those technology changes into the far future, but so that's been going on. But the other kind of category of things to think about is assessment and how you assess impacts as they occur over different time periods. And really, within the LCA research community, that interest in climate change assessment, given the current urgency of the situation, has really prompted over the last few years a greater interest in what does it mean to do climate change assessment using dynamic LCA framing for that. And that's really, the first paper was published around 2010 on that.
So it's pretty recent then.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say.
Yep. And what is the work that Massey is doing in terms of developing LCA techniques?
Yeah, so we have the Life Cycle Management Centre is based at Massey University, and we've been operating since 2010, actually. And we are interested in being at the forefront of development of new approaches in LCA. So we've got interested in dynamic LCA over the last few years and been doing some work to think about how you apply that in the context of buildings.
Mm-hmm. What work does that relate to in terms of the Construction 4.0 project?
Well, that project is a great platform for us to take forward this agenda. So we're really interested in exploring aspects related to, first of all, the materials that are used in a building. And if, for example, you do refurbishment in 30 years' time or 50 years' time, what types of material data sets do you use? What are the impacts associated with something that's going to be produced then? So a lot of organisations, industry sectors have been declaring that they're going to be carbon zero by 2050. That's only a few years away, only a few decades away. So do we need to take that into account when we're doing our modelling of buildings? Same applies for what I call supply chain services. So if we're looking at the end of life of a building and we're looking at, say, recycling activities, then how are we going to account for something that's going to be happening in 50 years' time? What's the best way? So that's the modelling. And then on the assessment, we're applying a dynamic LCA modelling technique in climate change assessment that looks at emissions as they occur year on year and their contributions going forward and how they accumulate over that time.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us an example of how dynamic LCA would work or has worked with a case study?
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things we've done is to produce, in association with BRANZ, some data sets for electricity supply in New Zealand. We've modelled it from 2020 out to 2050 and calculated the environmental impacts associated with 1 kilowatt hour of electricity for each of the years out to 2050. And we've done that using the scenarios that are produced by MB for electricity supply going forward and kind of where generation is going to come from. And we found that for example, the carbon footprint of the electricity generation will approximately halve over that time period. So by 2050, for all the scenarios, there's an approximate halving of the carbon footprint. So obviously the operational energy environmental impacts are going to change quite a bit over that time period.
Mm-hmm. Even in our low carbon project that we're doing with some BRANZ support as well, we found that because of climate change, whereas previously heating was a large contributor towards the operational carbon, now cooling is starting to become a larger contributor. So things really do change over time.
Yeah.
In terms of dynamic LCA, what kind of, because it's an innovative LCA approach, what kind of things would need to change in order for it to be adopted in more widespread in practice? So, for example, what would be the process to enable it once, the modelling techniques are there to allow it to be widely adopted? Are there standards that would need to change? Would environmental product declaration processes need to change? What needs to happen?
Yeah. So the standards that are available at the moment are all based on a static LCA approach. So, for example, EM 15004, when you're modelling activity that's going to happen in the future, it states that you have to use the current technology to model that. So there would need to be some changes to the standards, and that's again, something we're interested in exploring. What do you have to do? And kind of at a very basic level, if you look at the way people do LCA and collect the data, you wouldn't actually have to do much different. All you'd have to do is introduce a time period at which the activity takes place. And then there are already impact assessment data sets available that would enable you to kind of convert that into your dynamic LCA.
Okay. In terms of Māturanga Māori, so that's another part of the Construction 4.0 project, and I know it's an area where you've really shown an interest. How could that potentially be incorporated into LCA?
Yes. Okay, great question. I think there are two main ways in which we can look at progressing that particular agenda. The first one is the process by which we undertake an LCA study. So we have standards that govern the way we should be doing an LCA study and what you have to take into account. But if you look at it from a Te Ao Māori perspective, then it suggests some kind of additional angles that you can take. So there would be a lot more emphasis upon the context in which you're going to choose what you're going to focus on, and what alternatives that you're going to consider. My understanding is that from a Māturanga Māori perspective, what you want to do is bring much more consciously into that process the aspirations you have as a community or as a society. And I think that doesn't just apply to Māori, that could be kind of replicated on a much wider scale. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is thinking about culture as almost like an extra impact category. So in LCA, we look at environmental impacts, but some people are also using the LCA framework to think about social impacts and economic impacts. And alongside that, you can think about cultural impacts. So by actually consciously providing information about the cultural impacts associated with alternative activities, that kind of makes it much more part of the decision making, mm-hmm. which can be very important, of course, for some groups in society.
It's quite amazing how much innovation is happening in terms of LCA. Is there anything else? What's on the horizon for LCA?
What's on the horizon? Well, I think the dynamic LCA agenda is right up there, and particularly when we're thinking about long-lived products, of which buildings, of course, is a prime example there. So I would say that's one of the main agenda items to focus on at the moment. Another area in which I work is food LCA, and the work I've been doing there, which was actually led by the FAO, was looking at how we assess nutritional aspects of food alongside environmental aspects when we're doing an LCA. So for food items, conventionally, we look at kind of 1 kilogram of whatever, carrots or whatever it might be. But we could actually think of we should think of the prime function of food as being about delivery of nutrition. So if your functional unit, your unit of analysis for the study is nutritional value, what does that look like in terms of comparisons across different food types and their environmental impacts?
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually interesting, isn't it? 1 kilogram of carrots may have a lot more nutrition than infinite amounts of other foods.
Yes.
Okay, so is there anything else that you can see that relates to dynamic LCA and in terms of the future of construction? What kind of decisions would we make differently? And what would be the real impact of dynamic LCA adoption?
Yeah, I think, again, returning to the climate change agenda, it puts a lot more emphasis on what's going to happen in the next decade, really. So that's not to say we should ignore what happens after the next decade, but it's like more a change in the focus So I think it puts more emphasis upon what we can do right now and things like reuse in the near term. So, for example, for buildings, rather than just thinking about recycling at end of life in 50 or more years' time, is there something we can do now to reuse any waste materials that are already there and where it would be a fraction of the environmental cost to reuse them?
So there you go. Thanks for joining our conversation with Sarah today. If you'd like to connect more with her, you'll find her details in the show notes. Dynamic LCA offers a fresh perspective on understanding the environmental impacts of our construction practices over time, giving us the tools to make smarter, more informed decisions that align with a truly sustainable future. It's a reminder that our choices today directly shape the legacy we leave for tomorrow. Food for thought till we see you next time. So hit subscribe, and if you like what you heard today, please like, review or share with any metal minds you know. Let's spread the word. If today's kōrero on dynamic LCA and its role in shaping a sustainable future in construction has sparked your interest, why not join us at our ongoing seminar series, Tactics to Achieve Low Carbon Design for Steel and Steel Hybrid Commercial Buildings. This is your chance to dive deeper into the sustainable, low-carbon design approaches that are transforming our built environment in Aotearoa. The series kicked off today, but there are still sessions you can attend in Hamilton, Christchurch and Wellington. You'll find details to register in the show notes.